We are starting this afternoon session with our next panel, Mitigating the Risk of Greenwashing in Sustainable Finance. The growing appetite for ESG investments in rapidly changing markets create room for greenwashing. Greenwashing can adversely impact investors looking to make sustainable investments. In this session, our panelists will discuss how ASEAN encourages and increases green finance whilst avoiding greenwashing. How should we promote transparency and tackle greenwashing? Please welcome our moderator, Mr. Victor Tay. Victor is the CEO of ONERHT Consulting Asia, as well as CEO of the China-ASEAN Business Alliance. He is also CEO of Global Catalyst Advisory and Managing Director of South Asia, an investment banking group managing the Southeast Asia office. His areas of expertise include corporate strategic development, market entry and expansion strategy, direct investment, M&A and corporate finance advisory, and transaction support. He has assisted several Asian companies in going public successfully. With him today are Lorraine Delhomme, Associate Director, Climate Finance Asia, Yvonne York, Research Associate, Center for Governance and Sustainability, NUS Business School, and Michael Yin, Founder, Trinity Echo. Over to you, Victor and panelists.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to GIL Sustainability Forum. And for this segment, we are talking about mitigating the risk of greenwashing in sustainable financing. I'm Victor Tay. I'm the CEO with the ONERHT Group Consulting, and also I'm with the China-ASEAN Business Alliance as well. Right. For the topic itself, I think if we looked at it, mitigating the risk, I think the whole panel here will be discussing about how the approach, the means of how we mitigate the risk, and that will also include identification. And later on, we'll also be looking at the definition of what greenwashing is, and ultimately it's looking at how sustainable financing as a financial instrument and how we could actually help everyone to mitigate that. Yes. Okay, and let's have a little bit of a backdrop of what has been happening, right? So if you see just earlier after COP26 discussion, within here, if business as usual, we'll be having this climate temperature and also in terms of carbon emission. I think there's a need to actually stay below 1.5 degrees of global warming. And in here, what we have been doing is definitely not adequate. And hence, I guess at the recent COP26, numerous countries actually declare by 2050 to reach carbon zero. That's quite a staggering ambition to look at. Now, how would they be looking at? I think in here, if we dissect it from the 17 SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals from United Nations, in here, 17 parts of it, which are in order squares, and within the red color part, that's the part that has impact that I think we're focusing on that gives us a certain sustainable returns and impact in there. And so from here, I think it's staggered across from individuals, natural resources, partnership, and even from individual contribution. Now, if you look at the global financing segment, and that's what this panel discussion is about, if we looked at the left-hand side where the graph is, this graph on the left side basically highlight the financial impact. And our x-axis part, that's the part that is on social impact. So if we looked at it, that the top right-hand corner will be what we aspire to, and that's where most of the funds, and you see there's a light blue color and a light gray color, but some of the funds are focusing at impact first, and the other part will be focusing at financial first, right? And so on the right side, that basically has been announced post-COP26, where United Nations actually make the announcement that there's been 413 million that have been pledged to the most vulnerable countries at COP26. And in this case, it cut across, which you see the value chain there, on numerous part of those with financial impact, those with a blended impact between social, and on the far left side, there'll be those which are focusing on social impact and also in terms of helping the vulnerables, right? The various sustainable financial asset classes, and I think that's what we are looking at from the chart here. So within here, you could see that we have various part of this financial instruments. Below, impact first. On the blue one, financial first. And across the line from the left side, examples are from cash, senior debts, mezzanine financing, public equity, venture capital, private growth equity, real estate, and also with those who actually with absolute return, right? And hence, staggered across on the far right side, you'll see this 4-quadrant that highlight which on the y-axis, on impact first, financial first, and the other part on x-axis, developing and developed economy. So with that as a backdrop, I think that's where we looked at why do companies greenwash? Is that the prevalent issues? After we will discuss as well. I guess off the cuff, we do see client demand sometimes pressing, and some of this corporate find that it overweighs the ESG supply. Second part, I think some of them highlighted there's no standardized criteria, and that's where the panel will also discuss about will standards help? Is this enough? So some of the companies highlighted there's no regulated guideline that makes a company ESG compliant, right? And the third part, pressure and incentives. Many of them were looking into gaining favor from market consumers as consumers are becoming more discerning. And some of the non-market actors, regulators, etc., and they're yielding the pressure, right? So in here, that's where, will standards be sufficient? Would it be solutions? If we looked at some of the ESG standards from green products and the dark green products, right? The gray one are those who actually do not integrate sustainability into their investment process. The green one are those who promote environmental and social characteristics. And where Article 9, the dark green one, those are the ones with sustainable investment as their objective. And for today's discussion, I think that's where our perspective, our panel will be discussing coming from all these angles of policy, regulations, compliance, ethics. We'll be talking about education, if that could be a solution, ESG standards. We'll also be highlighting about disclosure and also market practices. And within here, I think we had also a panelist who actually went into technology, a science-based approach, which we will discuss. And some of these questions that we'll be discussing here will be, what is greenwashing? How do we identify it? How do we avoid it? Are there effective solutions from disclosure, the control, the council reporting, and down to are there a science-based or technology approach towards that? And ultimately, what other ways that we can also try to preempt this? Which the audience here, feel free to actually put in your questions. We'll be looking at it, and hopefully we can jointly co-create the solutions as well. And for today's panel, we will see Lorien. Lorien actually comes from the Climate Finance Asia. And with that, she's coming from the angle of sustainable financing. So later on, we'll have the round introduction from them. We had Yvonne. Yvonne comes from a Center for Governance and Sustainability. She's very much giving us an academic and research angle on this. And last but not least, we have Michael Yin, who is founder of Trinity Co. And he'll be coming in from sustainability angle, consultancy, and also technology angle. So with this, perhaps we'll have a round of introduction from everyone. Maybe give us a bit of introduction of your company and also about what your passion and focus on. Lorien, perhaps you may want to start.
Thank you. Thank you, Victor. So I'm Lauren. I'm the Assistant Director at Climate Finance Asia. We are a consultancy based in Hong Kong and Singapore, and we focus on all sustainable finance solutions. We help our clients, financial institutions, and corporates all across Asia to issue green bonds, social bonds, sustainability linked loans, but also we help them to verify their products, and we also do ESG integration for equity, fixed income, and indexed investment as well.
Yes, thank you. And that will be the financial assets advisory angle that she comes from. How about Yvonne? Give us a little bit about what the center focus on and also what your passion and...
Yeah, sure. Hi everyone. My name is Yvonne and I'm a research associate at NUS Business School Center for Governance and Sustainability. What we do at the research center revolves around research on corporate sustainability, like understanding how companies in the ASEAN region, how they report their sustainability issues, and also like what are the gaps in terms of sustainability reporting, and how we can try to inform policies and stuff like that. Yeah,
thank you. So Yvonne will be coming from governance policy angles and looking at how this can mitigate greenwashing, right? So let us go to our third participant, Micah. Micah, maybe give us a little bit about how Trinity Co, you're the founder of it. What does it focus on? And also what your perspective of this is.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael. So I am the founder of Trinity Eco, which is a sustainability tech company. So what we do is that we realize that about 60% of businesses and organizations do not really know what to do with their sustainability reports. So what we do is that we help them to build sustainability reporting systems to help them develop solutions and actions for to improve their sustainability ratings and to be more sustainable in the long term.
Right. Okay. So that's a technology approach with data and also a science approach. And later on, we'll delve in depth about it.
Yeah.
So let's begin the discussion. I think many of you will have been in your mind, what is greenwashing? Does greenwashing matter? And how do we identify it? Perhaps Yvonne, you can give us a definition from your center.
Okay, yeah, sure. So greenwashing, I mean, in the we don't talk about just like sustainable finance, but in a general term, greenwashing could be like companies doing selective disclosure. So they only talk about certain things, so they don't really talk about the negative aspects of their businesses. And it could also be like putting a positive spin. So they only talk about or focus about the positive aspects of their products. When it comes to sustainable finance, ESG products, greenwashing is often related to overselling of how sustainable the investment products are. So they, in the like investment prospectus, they could oversell on the sustainability aspects of the products. They could choose not to disclose that certain of their ESG products have very low ESG ratings and stuff like that. So yeah, these are, I mean, some of the things related to.
So over-exaggerating over what the product has?
Yep.
Or maybe even under-disclosing when
definitely.
it's not meeting the standards, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so how about identifying it? Is it easy to identify, looking at the prospectus, looking at the brochure?
I think in general, those prospectus, as with many investment products, you know, like the Lehman Brothers and stuff like that, those prospectus are kind of tricky because a lot of fine prints, and even for me, I don't think I would be able to identify everything. There are lots of things that they are shrouded in sort of like mystery for the average investor. So I think in terms of like avoiding greenwashing in ESG would be to look at the ratings of the ESG products. So think of like ratings from recognized ratings from only credible companies such as MSCI and Sustainalytics, and also look at the prospectus and see whether the companies that are selling the products, do they talk about how the ESG, this ESG product is going to, you know, like what is the money from this ESG product going to do? Like, are they going to help to remove carbon emission and stuff like that? And also recognize buzzword. Are there any claims that prove too good to be true? Yeah, so, but I mean, the ESG landscape is evolving, and so as consumers, I mean, investors and financial institutions become more savvy, I think this problem with greenwashing would be gradually diminished.
So look out for ESG rating. So that's one part of it.
Yeah.
Look out for over-exaggeration. Maybe let us ask a practitioner who have been looking at that, and particularly I think from Climate Finance Asia. I think you have numerous clients, you have been looking at the projects. How do you identify that? How do you see that there are greenwashing or elements of it?
I found interesting what Yvonne said about especially the selected disclosure, right? I think that's what we see most often. How do we see if a green bond is greenwashing? I would say it's the selected disclosure. So for example, A green bond, should I remind everyone what a green bond is?
Sure, why not?
So it's a fixed income product where the use of proceeds is supposed to go to green activities. So it's project-based. So the bond is only supposed to finance renewable energy, low carbon transportation, and a list of activities that actually are defined. And that's something we can touch on later, like how they're defined, who defines them. So how do we see if a green bond is greenwashing? First of all, normally 1 year after a bond is issued, they are supposed to disclose an annual report. In this annual report, they are supposed to disclose where the use of proceeds went, what did they finance. And we see a level of disclosure that is insufficient. Maybe they will talk about the higher activity. So they will say, we use that proceeds for renewable energy, but they did not disclose what type of renewable energy, what projects, what emissions threshold. And nowadays, this is just not enough to say renewable energy, because just to give you an example, for example, hydropower is renewable energy, but some hydropower dams and projects have a negative environmental and social impacts. So this is not enough nowadays to just give this high level of disclosure. We want to see a more granular level of disclosure, and also we want to see impacts that is quantitatively measured, and even better, we want to see external review on that annual report. So that's just an example. And to give you an example on loans, so the new product nowadays that is quite popular in Asia now is the sustainability-linked loan. So where the loan is associated to targets. So for example, they have to meet X% of emission reduction in X years. And if they meet that, then they can have a reduction in their interest rate. So this kind of a stick and carrot exercise. However, because it is a loan at the end of the day, they don't have to disclose the documents, and they don't have to disclose what those KPIs and targets are. So what we see is a PR exercise of companies doing press release saying, oh, we have a sustainability-linked loan, and it's great, and we're so green. But in reality, we don't have access to those documents, so we don't know if those targets are ambitious, relevant, are they even green. So there's a real lack of disclosure.
So one of the trill that you looked at is, as long as the declaration itself is not backed up by evidence and further reports, then that probably arises some suspicion.
It could be empty. It could be an empty promise. It could be just a PR exercise. Yeah.
Yes, right. And some of the companies were highlighting that because there's no standards or guidelines to how this disclosure is. Do you agree to that?
Not necessarily. I think that nowadays we see more and more regulation, and maybe Yvonne will be able to give us more on the regulation, but we have the ASEAN Green Bond Standards, we have the ASEAN Sustainability Bond Standards, and even now we have more and more different type of taxonomies issued in Asian countries. So you have the ASEAN Green Taxonomy, you have Malaysia and Singapore, developing their own taxonomies at the moment. So I will let my fellow panelists comment on that. But I do think that now we have enough standard to follow, that it is not enough to say that you didn't know or to just do the baby steps anymore.
Right, yes. So for those actually companies that highlight the guidelines were not clear, or maybe the standards were inadequate, I think from Laurent's point of view, there are enough standards out there. And many of the countries or regime are starting to develop their own regulations, and so that this guideline become clearer. Now, with that, perhaps I'll go to Micah that looks at this. Do you think standards is important? And standards in here, of course, I think for those who are falling short of standards, right? So the standards bring them a certain guideline on how to disclose it. Yeah, what are your thoughts about standards? Is this a solution to mitigate greenwashing?
Okay, so for this is a very good question. I think in the short term, yes, standards are important because they act as like targets for companies to meet. Because when they understand what to do and how to achieve it, it's very simple for them to actually be sustainable. But let's acknowledge it, it's just standards in the end of the day are just a set of guidelines for them to actually help them understand what they need to do to be sustainable. And while it's good to be as compliant as with many standards as they can, but in the end it's all about quality compliance, not just quantity compliance. So a company may be ambitious enough to actually do as many compliance work as possible, but in the end of the day, the quality matters. So how much, for example, if you're following one type of standards or one type of guideline, the impact that they bring to the community, the quantitative measurement of those compliance do matter. And it's actually matter more than say, if a company just follow one standard but do it really well, they are doing actually way better than a company that follow like 10 different standards and didn't really excel at any of them. So that's my point on this. Yeah.
Yes, that's a good point to delve further. That many companies that we talk to, they highlighted that, hey, look, I'm certified to this standard, right? I meet these guidelines. But here it is, I think, from what you're saying, that well, many of them are just meeting minimal standards, and that's not as good as ability to follow one single standard and drilling the depth of it.
Yes.
And you also talk about quality and quantitative, right? Maybe expound further on that. On the quantitative part and the quality part, right? So how do you think that we can show more depth in terms of their compliance? Many of them just certify to mere certification, right? But we don't quite see the data part or the quantitative part. Maybe you might want to just expand and elaborate on that, especially that's part of your business model too, right?
Yes. So what I can say is that there's many types of sustainability reports. So the first level is usually the carbon calculators, which is freely available. You know, you can go to Global Compact. They have a very good carbon calculator, and basically what they do is just measure the carbon emissions of individual activities or of an individual company. But the most common one is usually energy audits, which is mostly used by buildings to actually determine the utility consumption, but also the carbon emissions of their infrastructures. And then you have carbon emission reports and sustainability reports and so on. So from a data approach, in regards to greenwashing, you can tell a product is greenwashed when the carbon emission calculation of their supply chain is much higher than what they proclaim as a net zero or as sustainable, you know. And using certain parameters to actually measure the amount of environmental and social impact of the product or of the company is some of the best ways to actually better assess a company's sustainability and performance, not just on the company level, but also on the product level. I think the two types of assessments that is commonly coined by a lot of sustainability professionals are the materiality assessment and also the life cycle assessment. So what they do is that they don't just identify carbon emissions on a company level, but also with their stakeholders. So, for example, Unilever, for example, and IKEA, for example, they don't just comply on the company level, but they also make sure that their suppliers, their partners, will provide the materials and the products that they need to sell in the market, also as compliance to the sustainability standards as possible. Because if they don't, they usually either make it difficult for them to sell with them or to work with them in the long run. So those are I feel it's the long-term direction for most companies, and it will no longer be just the corporates who will comply, because last time it would be corporations who need to comply based on the stock exchange regulatory. But now, because there's this huge crackdown on greenwashing by a lot of these countries, the smaller guys will also have to come on board eventually.
Yes, so good point in there about I think companies that comply from enterprise angle, that's one, but of course there's a need to go into the product life cycle. And I think that's where the materiality part of it is also very important. And I guess one sign that you highlighted were overstating what their carbon reduction is. And I guess those are telltale signs that we can look at. And hence, I guess, very much you were looking at the data approach. And some of this, the data can give us some more evidential or empirical aspects so that we can tell there is certain greenwashing within there, right? So out there, I think some of them were talking about maybe standards, guidelines, education will help. Now, back to since the Center of Governance and Sustainability, is education enough for what we are doing? We see plenty of forum like this. We saw a lot of training. A lot of people are looking at it. And also, as we are discussing, new taxonomies are being put out.
Yeah.
What do you think about the education part?
I feel like with the, I mean, you pointed out rightly that I mean, such forums, whether they are really adequate in educating people, and I feel like such forums, they are preaching to the people who are already in this sphere, so they already have an inkling about greenwashing issues. So I think it's about reaching out to the people who are still not very sure about what greenwashing is. So I feel like the taxonomy, they do go some ways in helping prevent or sort of like mitigate greenwashing. So for instance, the MAS is very concerned about greenwashing. So they have this GFIT, which stands for Green Finance Investment Task Force taxonomy. So basically, what they are doing is trying to come up with the various categories to sort of like categorize what are the economic activities that are considered greenwashing or like not so good, and the economic activities that are environmentally friendly, and also looking at how to disclosures, like disclosure standards. And I think this is not unique to Singapore. So other countries such as the UK as well, they're all doing this. So I think because like the problem with greenwashing in sustainable finance is that there's no clear idea of what constitutes ESG products that's considered greenwashing. So there's no common standards. I mean, there are too many standards, and so like everyone can say that, oh, like I'm following this, so I'm not greenwashing. But sometimes when I look at those ESG investment products, then I see companies that I think are not exactly environmentally friendly. For instance, I've looked at some ESG products, and I've seen companies such as Apple. And I mean, like we all know, like Apple has was involved in some debacle. I'm not sure about now. So I was asking myself, like, is this really a good ESG product? So I think like with such standards, and if like people can all agree that, oh, okay, if certain activities are considered not good for the environment, then if these companies are engaged in such businesses, then they should not be included in this ESG stock. Then I think like as people have the common understanding, then greenwashing would help to be eradicated or reduced in frequency.
Yeah, so the ESG products, those who are compliant, those who are not, do you think that is also debatable as well? Since after all, certain products in terms of pricing costs, that actually affect how the final product is. And therefore, to go towards some other more compliant products at times can be more expensive, and it actually hurts the consumer wallet. Any thoughts about it?
Yeah, I mean, I hear you. So some of the questions brought up by investors include ESG products can be more expensive, and the returns might not might take a longer time to materialize as compared to traditional stock investments. I've came across studies that found that in the long run, ESG products do have good returns. So I guess it's all about education, and also what are the values of the investor. So some people just value quick profit over profits that take a longer time to materialize. So I think it depends on individual, but yeah, so I think it's very...
That's a topic that I'll probably open to Laureen and Michael as well. And then in this part, while you're thinking about it, because I think many businesses highlighted, by adopting that, there's a cost issue. The consumer may not sustain it, right? And therefore in here, is that a full-fledged compliance towards that, or maybe you have to balance off a consumer preference? So while you're thinking about it, for those who are now listening to the forum, do feel free to put in your questions. I'm looking at it, and I think any questions that come in, and we can actually address it, analyze it, and also co-create a solution together. So for those who are actually looking at education about ethics, sustainability, etc., GIL, RHT had also a Grace Institute, and they basically very much expound about ethics, governance, and areas about sustainability as well. So these are, I think you can actually, if any inquiries, you can also approach the RHT Grace Institute and also the Rajan Menon Foundation that runs this, right? So with that, let me come back to Laureen on the question on what just now Yvonne was highlighting, right? In terms of incorporating all this ESG compliant product versus cost versus consumer.
I think I just wanted to go back to the education point,
yes.
Because what's the step before that? The companies are advised they don't want to get educated out their goodness of their heart, or they don't suddenly find a sudden passion for sustainability. There's two things that triggered this demand for education. It's the regulatory pressure on one hand and the investor pressure. So I think it's very important to highlight that only if we get those two elements, the regulatory pressure and the investor demand, then the corporate and financial institutions come to us and ask, okay, how can we meet this demand, and what are we supposed to know? And then we start the education process, which can take some time actually. And then I think one of the questions we get the most is, why would I do this? It's slightly more expensive to go for a green bond than a normal bond or for other products. Why would I do this? And then some of the answers we give is, first of all, there's a lot of different benefits. By going for green or sustainable products, you can first diversify your offerings, but also diversify your investors' options. Maybe you will reach new kinds of investors. And then there is just the risk aspect. You go ahead of risk, reputational risk, regulatory risk, and we know they are coming. We know that in Singapore, I think it's just next year that companies will have to disclose a TCFD report. So for those who don't know, TCFD is the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosure. I think I missed financial climate-related disclosure. And so it's coming, and so that's one of the things we highlight, is that you want to get ahead of this before it hits you, either on the reputational side or on the regulatory side.
Yes. And what about Michael? What is your take on the topic on this part of incorporating all-out compliant to ESG consumer preference, and also in terms of pricing, and also balancing cost and profit, right?
Actually, I've done a similar topic on a platform called Clubhouse. So for people out there, we have a Clubhouse group that talk about environmental issue every Saturday. So I think in regards to this is that actually consumers are actually more prepared to pay for it. And there is a survey done, actually not just one survey, multiple surveys that's done that shows that people are more than willing to pay extra to be sustainable in their lifestyle. I think it's like what a lot of mentioned is, how do you prevent greenwashing of those consumer products? And the good news is there's a lot of data tools that is already available to help calculate individual carbon emissions on an individual level. So I mean, I think a really good example is Handprint. They actually work with e-commerce stores to actually calculate the carbon emissions and carbon offsetting potential of the consumer products that is being sold on the e-commerce stores. So I think they recently won the Microsoft Green Tech Challenge and doing some great things, you know, in helping customers be aware of what they're purchasing on the marketplace. So this is a very good example of a data-centric approach. Other examples as well, I think in regards to, in terms of conscious purchasing, is that there is carbon calculators that can, like I mentioned, that could be used to actually, by users to actually calculate their carbon emissions on a daily activity basis. So in the end, you can have very good products, but also practices also matters. So do the employees or the individual use public transport often? Do they source their electric consumption from a green provider, and etc.? So all this actually, all these small details play a very key difference, but I think it's awareness. One is awareness and education. And I think that part is a really a huge challenge, because we can teach the head knowledge, and it's already been done in a number of universities and training agencies. But it's the practical part. How do you use it to manage costs? How do I use sustainability to generate revenue? How do I use sustainability to properly build stakeholder relationships and have better business relationship with my suppliers? Those are things that is not usually taught in schools.
Yeah, so from Michael, you hear that he highlighted that, in fact, being compliant in ESG does have financial benefits as well. And he had also highlighted a survey where numerous of them, consumers highlighted they are more discerning about what products are ESG compliant, and they prefer these products as well. So it's actually a good marketing competence as well to actually brand yourself as ESG compliant, right? And in here, Michael also talked about education, that just now where we started off. For some of you who are online, do feel free to put in your questions, and that's why we can analyze it and we can also co-create a solution. But if you have been following our discussion, we have started to talk about what is greenwashing, and that's where I think from the center of governance and sustainability, I think they highlighted greenwashing. That's where you overstated, or in fact under-declare, or even do not disclose some of your non-compliant products in there. And so we had also highlighted how to identify, and I think Laureen actually found that I think once you trace beyond the superficial declarations, as you go deeper, you can trace what are those projects they go into, and where some of data are scarce, that invites suspicion. And hence, I guess that also then brings us to when Michael highlighted looking at some of the data, empirical data, that actually helps, how they actually state their carbon emissions. When it's overstated, over-exaggerated, it's easy to tell. And in here, the whole discussion, the panel discussion also highlighted guidelines are good, standards are good to have, but nonetheless, that is also a minimum guideline. But does that mean that you're certified to maybe 5 different standards, or means that you're great in your ESG compliance? Not necessary. I think we highlighted it's a depth of how you go into, and that's important. And that's where later on we actually highlighted maybe education is important, so that part not only just for consumers, but also for the corporates, right? So that has been what the discussion has been from beginning to now. And maybe let us now look at what are the more effective measures then, given that we talk about education, disclosure, guidelines. They're there as a guideline, right? As for supporting indicators. Perhaps we can take a leaf off some of the economic regime. And I saw Europe. Europe has its own environmental protection regulation that's early in the 1970s. And being early starters, they had also been embracing with a lot of regulations in this area. And we see also within there, they have come up with a Financial Reporting Council, ESG Sourcebook, Stewardship Code, and some disclosure guideline. Maybe, Laureen, since you also very familiar with Europe, tell us more about what they have done. And within there, are there certain leaves of practices that we can actually in Southeast Asia follow?
Sure. I think right now, at least in sustainable finance, something that is quite impactful is the up-and-coming EU taxonomy. so developed in the EU, but that will impact Asian investors in Asian asset managers, actually. So we already see some clients come and ask us, how do we become compliant with the EU taxonomy? So this taxonomy, a bit like the taxonomies in Asia, will determine what are the green activities, and under each activities, what are the emissions threshold to be deemed as green. So I think that's quite important, this idea of setting a quantitative threshold of emissions. And hopefully it will inspire more stakeholders here in Asia to align with that. But I think the Asian taxonomies are on a really good way. They're a bit different because, for example, if you look at the Singapore, but also ASEAN taxonomies, they have a system of being 3 colors, red, amber, and green. So it indicates if you are aligned with the Paris Agreement, if you are maybe in transition, or if you are a technology that is completely not aligned with the climate change. So that's a different way of looking at it, that the EU taxonomy that really set a quantitative CO2 emission threshold. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's one of the regulation that are coming from Europe, but are impacting this region.
Yeah, so the color codes, and therefore the declaration of the different product level. Mm-hmm. So these are some of the good practices that you see. We also see that there were financial reporting council and various part of regulations that being considered in Europe and might be materializing soon. Any one of these that you think that are probably good to have, that even to be considered in this region?
I think the one that comes to my mind is the one I mentioned earlier, the TCFD. I will not attempt to say the whole name again. The TCFD disclosures that will become mandatory here in Singapore in next year. That is actually an international initiative. And basically what it says is that you have to disclose how you manage climate change, how you look at it, who on your board supervise it, how you will monitor it annually, how it impacts your balance sheet. There's a lot of, you have to quantify how it affects your business. You have to do some climate stress tests. It's actually quite technical, and I think it will take companies quite a long time to fully embrace the depth of the disclosure. But personally, I think it's a great initiative, and as we said, the more data, the more disclosure, and the deeper the disclosure, the better.
Yes.
Right. So TCFD, which is mandatory, that is coming soon, the year after. So in this case, how about Michael? Any perspective about what are the more effective solution to this? I mean, this is a perspective that was taken off EU, what they were doing. Any other thoughts about what we can do more, or how we can actually make this to mitigate greenwashing, especially in this part of the world?
I think having the right tools to better assess climate risk is really important. I think the problem is there's not enough awareness of it, like I say. So there's a lot of debates on what type of tools are there, but there's usually the 4 types of tools. One is the standards and frameworks. So like what the rest have already said, like TCFD, GRI, SASB, even B Corp. So those standards, like I say, and like I mentioned, is focusing on creating benchmarks, helping customers to know where their targets are. And different countries follow or primarily focus or actually prefer certain standards. B Corp is more popular in the US. TCFD and GRI is mostly European. CDP is mostly in the Middle East and in China. And then SASB is more popular with industry, with financial industry, because they mostly focus on financial metrics. So depending on which industry and which country you're in, most likely you will prefer one or two of them. Oh yeah, one more thing is TCFD is also more popular with technology because it's focused on technical and technology readiness standards in a way. So that's why I think the mandatory part is a good thing because manufacturing do require better understanding of their environmental carbon emissions in their processes. The second type would be data aggregators and platforms. So they actually help to interpret the data, they help to collect the data, and their main role is also to help visualize the information in a way that people understand. So there's a lot of them out there already. In fact, I think the Swiss government recently provide a report on the 8 different types of data tools. You're talking about digital payment systems, like I mentioned, with handprint they all that do carbon emissions on a consumer purchasing level. There's digital platforms that provide automated or using AI to actually assess climate investments. There's data analytics tools that helps to manage huge chunk of information from building infrastructures and IoT systems. There's even risk assessment for insurance technology. So I think that is a very key point because as we have more climate-related disasters, I think insurers are also being affected because they have to cover more damages that is caused by climate change. So they are now also assessing climate risk to determine the level of coverage provided. And lastly, you have also crowdfunding and crypto. Even blockchain is also starting to come on board on that. So all these tools are useful, but it's all about how to integrate all these tools because they don't speak the same language. And most importantly, they must speak in a language that the financial professionals and the public understand. Because if you give them a chunk of environmental data, I think they might go a bit crazy on what it means. But if you translate it in a language that they understand, or it can improve their cost savings, it can reduce their costs or improve their revenue, I think that would be much easier. The other tool would be specialized database. This is usually exclusive to the industry. Usually is by governmental or military or even special associations. They have the sources, they have information that most public databases do not have. And also, lastly, rating agencies. In fact, the EU taxonomy was developed to actually compete with the rating agencies that's mostly based in the US. That's why the EU taxonomy was formed. But the competition is not a bad thing. It's good because it improves data quality and much more deeper disclosure of companies' environmental readiness.
Yes. So you probably heard the array of tools and mechanisms that Michael had highlighted. There are plenty out there that you can adhere to, from the taxonomy down to the database, down to the assessment tools that you could have. And so all of this are what we can actually look at to mitigate greenwashing. We're into the final minutes of our discussion, and I'm just wondering, anyone who, from the floor, anyone from the audience who wants to give your opinion or maybe even ask some questions or maybe trying to attempt to put up a solutions out here. So if there are, do key it in the next 2 to 3 minutes. If not, I think if you have been following our discussion, we had gone from defining greenwashing, how to identify it, how to avoid it, and we had discussed about the various standards, the education process of it, and we tried to take a leaf off EU, what they have done, and how in this region, in Southeast Asia, how we will be looking at it. And in the last part, we are also looking at technologies, how technologies can help us in here. So anyone with the last questions, do feel free to key in. So while with that, let me then ask the panelists here for perhaps their last words or perhaps what they feel on the topic itself, right? What is effective to mitigate greenwashing? I mean, this is a perennial issue and has been ongoing. Maybe starting with Yvonne, what are your thoughts on it? And after that, we'll come to Lorraine and then Michael.
So I feel that regulations will go some way in helping mitigate greenwashing because when there are regulations, then the companies or the investment firms that were previously guilty of greenwashing, they know that there are some rules and probably punishments that would be meted out, and then that would that would definitely help them to help in prevent greenwashing, because they would think twice about it.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So there's one approach on it. Yeah, and we had someone from the floor who actually put in a question here. Ahmad Magat, who is a good friend of ours too. He's with Dynavision Advisory. So he made the statement, one effective approach that goes beyond traditional measures of profits and returns on investments and the shareholders is the triple bottom line approach, right? So the triple P, people, planet, profit. This incorporates, and the three Ps, right? So he highlighted, could anyone here share your experience if you come across organizations in Europe or US that has employed the triple P approach and have it and still be effective? I suppose there are plenty of examples, right? Mm-hmm. But I guess Ahmad Magat's question was how effective they are, and we have a good example to raise. Michael, I see you're quite ready to to expand on this. Yeah. So maybe
Please.
come. Yes.
That's a good question. I think I'll give a brief history of the people, planet, and profit. It's talking about the three tenets of sustainability, which is environmental, which is the most popular one right now, social, which is how do you treat people and treat employees, and also economic, which is basically the bottom line. So I think that this term was quoted back in the early 1970s, 1972 actually, when they coined the definition of sustainability from a global perspective. So I think to keep it short is that I think some companies have really do manage to do it, like I should say Ben & Jerry would be one, but I think at the time they were not just highlighting where they get their source the materials from, that's to fulfill the environmental part, but also job creation, and also determining how much jobs they're providing, and also the certifications that justify the treatment of farmers and their suppliers. And also, most importantly, of course, the financial performance, like how the environmental and social performance actually affects their financial performance in a positive way. But there's so many examples, and I suggest if you want to look at a very good sustainability report that actually shows all this, CDL would be a very good report to look at, because they write very good sustainability reports on this, and and IKEA as well. But I think with so much information in the internet, the public can actually go out and do their own due diligence. Yeah.
So thanks, Ben and Jerry, IKEA, even local company CDL. Lorraine, being based in Europe previously, so I'm sure there are plenty of Euro examples, right? Would you want to raise some of it?
I can't think of any precise example right now, but I think the triple bottom line can work because it reminds me of what Michael said earlier, which is that nowadays there are people clearly that are willing to pay for services or products from a company that they know take good care of their people and take good care of the planet as well. And especially if you think of the emergence of new consumers, the millennials, the Gen Z, we know that they are there's a new demand for more disclosure and for good practices. So I think more and more there are people willing to pay for those good companies.
Yes. So thanks for Ahmad Bhagat for your questions, and I guess those are the response. And therefore we come to the last part, which I was asking everyone to summarize on your approach on what is the effective measure, right, to mitigate greenwashing. So Yvonne had highlighted, and Lorraine.
How to mitigate greenwashing.
Yes, that's right. And that's a whole topic that we have been discussing for the last 1 hour.
So the regulation, making all standards and guidelines mandatory, but also just disclosing more and not understating the depth of the knowledge of investors nowadays. They will ask more questions, and they will ask those questions around sustainability. So if you think that you can do a green bond nowadays that is a bit of a greenwashing green bonds, it will be harder because investors are more and more educated on that topic. And what I wanted to say is that this sustainable finance field is very new. It has evolved so fast. Just the green bonds I saw 5 years ago compared to now, they are not the same quality. It has evolved so fast, and I think it will continue to evolve, and we see better and better quality, better and better disclosure. So I think I like to end on this positive note that I think hopefully we'll see less and less greenwashing thanks to everything getting in place from all the stakeholders.
Yes, thank you. And Michael?
I think I'll end this off by giving a bit of an example. I think recently we heard about Elon Musk complaining why the oil and gas companies are doing better than him. But there is a reason. I mean, yes, Elon Musk is the poster boy of electric cars and sustainable technology, but I think he's a very good example of, that regulators are looking beyond the hype. Because, I mean, people think that, okay, a sustainable technology, surely it is sustainable in every way, right? But let's acknowledge that, electric cars, for example, in this case, where do you get your battery from? Do you get it from a factory that produce them in a coal-powered energy source? Are the metals sourced from ethical sources and all this stuff? So just to give a brief conclusion is that, sustainability is not skin deep like it used to be. Now it requires a bit more understanding, not just on the environmental impact of the technology when it is launched, but also the environmental impact of it when it is made, and also where they do all the sourcing of materials. So I think to conclude this is that, what they say in 1972 is that every economic and social upheaval has an environmental origin. And if we don't deal with the environmental impact of our activities, it will come back to bite us in the social and economic performance of our company. Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you that we saw the panel. And if I could summarize, I think the panel had actually talked about what are the effective measures. On the industry level, perhaps was to ensure there are education, clear guidelines, standards, minimally, at least for companies to adhere to and understand where they could follow. But the panel here also highlighted that standards, guidelines are mere just a benchmark. And that probably by itself is not a high, it doesn't mean quality. So that basically meant you have arrived, but you have not actually reached the epitome of it. So I guess that's where the discussion went on further, to say there's a need to actually use, to go deeper, to use various tools, database, assessment, and therefore assess a carbon footprint to ensure you're there, and therefore you're able to be compliant. And on how to mitigate and how to identify what are this, some of them who are greenwashing, I think has been stated by the panelists, like from Center of Governance, actually highlighted. Look at the declaration, those which are overestimated, those which are over what the industry benchmark, do look at it with a certain microscope. And Lorraine highlighted, looked at and trace it. If they highlight the declaration here, then where's the project? Is there a project declaration as well? The granularity of it is necessary. And with that, I think all the panelists agreed that I think there's a need to ensure not just a preliminary standard, but actually ability to go forward. And I liked particularly what Michael highlighted that since 1972, right? And where every one of this upheaval and any changes to the financial world, there's always a social impact to begin with. If not, it comes back and haunt us. And I also like to use what Lorraine highlighted. I think moving forward, we could only be more positive. And we'll reach there eventually that greenwashing will no longer be a term that people looked at. And hopefully the word greenwashing will be obsolete. So with this, allow us to give the panelists a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.